Hello, and welcome to another Music at Queen's chat, part of a series on our YouTube channel that marks time until we can ask our guest artists back into our venues in person. Today, I'm talking to QUB Big Band founder conductor Stephen Barnett. There, we heard the band in action in Joe Zawinul's classic Mercy, Mercy, Mercy. I'm going to be speaking to Steve about the big band and about his former life as an Ulster Orchestra trombone. So, Steve, we were listening there to QUB Big Band, and with that, I want to say a warm welcome to Music at Queen's. And you need no welcome, obviously, to Queen's music itself, because you've been an integral part of what we do in Queen's University for so long. I think you came to Northern Ireland about the same time that I did. Did you ever imagine that this was where your professional base was going to be?
No, I don't think anybody ever does. You don't know what's in front of you. When I left college in 1981, I was freelancing, and of course, with music being an international, occupation, you've no idea where you're going to end up. And it just so happened in 1982 there were 6 trombone jobs available in the UK, and I applied for all of those jobs. And the last one was the Ulster Orchestra, and that was the one that I eventually was offered. So that's why I came over to Northern Ireland. Of course, that was right in the time of the Troubles, but that didn't really cross my mind at the time. As you can imagine, in music, a job's a job. You grab onto it with both hands. So that's what I did, and I came over here. My life now is now over here, of course. So you make the best of what you do.
Yeah, exactly the same thing that brought me to Belfast about the same time,
Yeah.
late 1981. I mean, there are very few jobs with composer written on them, but I found one of them,
No.
and so I arrived here. In fact, my first Ulster Orchestra concert, I think, was October 1981, something like that, and so we go back the same time. And
I mean, my only experience, of course, of Northern Ireland at that time was what everybody in England saw on the news, which wasn't exactly very good. And my father had been over here with his work to do a couple of exhibitions at some stage. And I always remember him saying he had the best time when he was over in Belfast. He always enjoyed coming over here, even though it was in the Troubles. So that was really the only experience of Northern I had at the time, of Northern Ireland that I had. But of course, I decided to stay because I enjoyed it here so much.
absolutely. In fact, I used to come over as a child in the 60s, and then perhaps not so much during my teens. And my brother had lived here as well, so I had a similar sense that I already knew what a great
Yes.
place it was to live. I didn't know much or anything about it musically, apart from, of course, the BBC Northern Ireland Orchestra conducted by Havelock Nelson, which was
Yeah.
regularly on the airwaves before and indeed after you joined, I'm sure.
Yes.
Um, but you played with the orchestra for many years, and then you went freelance, and I'm very interested to know quite how what the different kind of lifestyle was for you. I mean, that seems like a big change after the security of the orchestra. I mean, was that positive, or was it a mixed thing? You must miss the security in some ways, and it allows you to do things in others.
Well, yes. Well, at the time, I didn't really have any choice because I had what was called a focal dystonia, and I had to leave the orchestra because my embouchure wasn't working properly. So, and that, of course, was very scary at the time, having had 28 years of a solid job, being paid regularly, every 4 weeks.
28.
Yeah, 28 years I was there, yeah. So I left the orchestra in April 2010. And of course, I had no idea what was in front of me then. I knew I was doing some teaching, of course. I was already been working at Queen's. I'd already done some work at the University of Ulster some years before that. And there was various gigs to be done around, and I was doing jazz piano at the time, and writing and conducting and things. So I just had to basically just jump in with both feet and just see what happened. Obviously, I secured as best I could, my financial future and tried to make sure we had a roof over our heads. And then we just let the cards fall where they will and just see what happened. And I've been very fortunate that I've managed to keep my head above water since. So, and Queen's has obviously been a very important part of that.
And do you think that Northern Ireland is a good place for that crisis to have occurred for you? I mean, compared with, if you'd been in one of the Manchester orchestras or something? I mean, are there advantages here because, I don't know, it's a small place and you already were well known, maybe?
Well, yes. I mean, there's obviously differing things you have to think about. Over in England or on the mainland there, there's obviously a lot more available because of the weight of population. Manchester is a very important musical hub, of course, but as you rightly said, I'd already been over in Northern Ireland for quite some time, and I was already known over here, if you like. And in many ways, it's a smaller pond, as you say. So there was more to be done from that point of view. Having said that, over in like Manchester or London, there's a great, plethora of things going on, as you well know yourself. So I really had no choice in the matter. I just had a family. I was bringing up a family at the time, of course. So you just have to deal with it the best way you can. It wasn't really an option to go back over to England unless I was invited to do something particular. There was no thought of actually relocating again. My wife and my children are all born here and brought up here, and I'm kind of naturalised now. I mean, I've been here what 38 years now, and I suppose I'm still a bit of a blow-in, as they call it.
Same here.
Yeah, exactly. And everybody says, "Well, you haven't lost your accent," and all that kind of thing. So, but I've always enjoyed my life over in Northern Ireland, and you just make the best of it, whatever you've got. You just roll your sleeves up and say, right, let's get on with this and do what we can.
Absolutely.
And that's what I did.
I mean, in the decade, we should congratulate you on your freelance decade, which was marked in the middle of COVID, I guess.
Yes.
I mean, that is a serious achievement. I don't know if anybody else noticed it, but I mean, that is, you've made a success of a big life change for any musician.
Yes.
I wondered what you thought about orchestral life, though, because I mean, in the decade since you've left, the Ulster Orchestra has seen some very difficult times and some amazing triumphs as well. So it's been a very turbulent decade and a very creative, artistic decade for them. Do you regret it? Are you glad to be out of, I mean, given the sort of various turmoils, are you glad to be out? Or
well, to be honest, the orchestra has always had some sort of turmoil going on ever since I was in it. I mean, I joined the Ulster Orchestra not long after the amalgamation with the old BBC Northern Ireland Orchestra and the strike. Remember the BBC strike they had? It wasn't long after that when Danny Longstaff, who was the first trombone in the orchestra, left and went to the CBSO in Birmingham. And I came over and filled the gap there, and that was right at the end of 1982. So nearly every year it seemed there was always some sort of financial crisis in the orchestra. We had a pay freeze for many years. All that, they were always going cap in hand to the Arts Council and the BBC to try and get more funding. So even though the last decade has been tough, it's been tough for everybody, it's been tough for the orchestra. I mean, it was nothing new to the orchestra. As you know, in arts funding, it's not at the top of the tree by any stretch of the imagination. It's one of the first things they can get away with cutting without having to worry about it, because when you've got the fire service and the police service and all the other things and the NHS, they all come way above arts. And the orchestra was always seen as the top of the tree in Northern Ireland, which it quite rightly is, of course, and professionally, and it always got the lion's share of the funding. So we always felt that we had to produce a really good product, if you like, for that money, and I always thought we did. There was a certain amount of touring we did, not much by any stretch of the imagination when you compare it to the other Scottish, English and Welsh orchestras, But we did do some touring in the times I was there, and in the last 10 years there's been relatively very, very little touring from the orchestra, as far as that's concerned. And we always thought that would have been a good thing to do, because it really puts Northern Ireland out there, on the world stage. And it's one of the things that the Ulster Orchestra can project for Northern Ireland at a professional and world-class level. I've always felt, of course, I would say that being from the Ulster Orchestra, but many people have agreed with us in the past how good the orchestra is, in relation to what is perceived to be, So that's really, as far as what the orchestra has done, I always think they've done a really first-class job. No matter what the funding crisis has been, we've always tried to get through that, even in the dark times of the Troubles. You remember when, I've done concerts where there's been bombs gone off, the lights have gone out in Newry Town Hall once. We carried on playing Dvorak Symphony, I think, when the lights completely went dark. We just carried on playing.
You knew it by heart, so that was all right.
Yeah, that's it. And there's been bombs gone off, and we've carried on. There's been the concert's been stopped once or twice, and then we just carry on playing, you know. And they've always just really rolled up the sleeves and got on with it. That's a good thing about the orchestra.
Funnily enough, talking of the demands on other areas of the public purse, for example, you know, police, ambulance, fire services, it turned up in some research done in Queen's that one of my predecessors, Professor Raymond Warren, was recalling how the brass section, of which you were a distinguished member since 1982, 10 or 15 years before that, the brass section was actually sort of seconded from the Royal Ulster Constabulary, so that there were extra brass players, because of course the orchestra was smaller then, wasn't it? It wasn't the full
Yes.
symphony orchestra. And so when, of course, they wanted to do extra things and trombones and tubas were needed, some of the constabulary were brought in, but unfortunately they went on duty at 10 o'clock at night. So if a gig ran on, they tended to have to simply down tools and disappear, which is a great kind of bit of job sharing. I love that story. Yeah.
That's it. Yeah. Oh, that's quite some time ago. That now, when they used to get the players in.
Mid-60s maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. They used to. I mean, we always got the best professional players, and there are a few good professional freelance players in Northern Ireland, but not very many, as you know, because of the fact that the majority of the work that's available for freelancers is, of course, on the mainland. Also, the fact that the professional schools of music, really, the colleges of music, are over in England and Scotland and Wales and that. You know, even though Queen's a very prestigious university, it's not the first place that, if you're going to go into it as a practical musician, you would think of doing it. I've taught many players who have actually shown very good promise, and they do their degree in Queen's, and then they go on to study actual performance over in England. And of course, when you're in there, you tend to stay there, you know, and that's what tends to happen. So the orchestra has always had that bit of an extra bill for getting players, freelancers from across the water, which is something that people don't realise sometimes. To get the required level of competence to play in the professional orchestra, you sometimes have to go further abroad than our shores. Even though there are players here which are very, very good indeed, you know, and to get the actual amount of work, they have to go across, you know, to England most of the time.
So obviously your life up to that point, 2010, must have been very largely dominated by classical rehearsals and concerts, a very regular kind of diet, I would think, of rehearsal and performance. Yeah. Was there much room for jazz? Because we associate you so much with jazz now, but I'm wondering, given that you always had a background in different kinds of non-orchestral music, I'm wondering whether you were really able to do that. I mean, maybe you've had more free rein for that since you were forced to give up the chair.
Well, when I was actually in the orchestra, of course, as you have rightly said there, I mean, my time was the orchestras. So anything extracurricular, I had to fit in myself. But there was the opportunity for the occasional gig here and there to play with my colleagues, which I can now do more often, of course. But I used to find time to do it, and of course I always played piano anyway. Right from I was like 5 years old, I was tinkling around the piano, you know. So I was always able to do that at home. And then there was occasions when I used to play jazz trombone with various ensembles, and if the orchestra wasn't working, then, you know, we could do it. That was one of the things. Some of the times, if you're doing like an afternoon reception or a gig, maybe the orchestra wasn't working because, you know, the orchestra works at different hours. We're not working 9 to 5 all the time, you know. So there was opportunity, but obviously that opportunity became much more when I left the orchestra, and I could actually have more control over my time, being a freelancer, as it were, you know, from the playing side of things. But then, of course, you've got teaching. That obviously became more important, and then teaching hours have to be taken care of as well. So it's always a balancing act, as you well know yourself. You know, if you're teaching, you can't be writing, so you have to find time to fit it in somehow or other. And that's the beauty. It's a 24-hour, 7-day job being a musician, as you know. So that's the way it works.
Absolutely, yes. You must have had more jazz recently, you know, I suppose, in recent times. But you started out, did you start out as a jazz player or a classical player, or maybe
That's a good
neither of
question.
the two? Maybe you
It's a
started
good.
out
That's a very good question because,
as a brass
like I
band
said,
player.
well, a little bit earlier on, as I said, I was tinkling away on the piano when I was just a little child, and basically that would have been in the start of the jazz because I was playing by ear, as it were, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
The brass came later on when I started on cornet because my father was a brass bander, and he put me on to cornet, and then I went into brass bands, and as soon as I saw the trombone, I fell in love with that, and quite quickly, when I was about the age of 10 or 11, swapped over to trombone, and then, well, the rest is history as far as that's concerned. But you know, all the time there was always a question of ear training, and I think a lot of that came from my training with the Royal School of Church Music because I was a choir boy, you know, at the time to do it. So the singing was I was singing a lot of the time, and as part of that, you would do structured courses in oral training as part of the Royal School of Church Music's own exam structure. So there was always a sense of training the ear, which you look back on now and you think that was absolutely invaluable.
Yeah.
You know, you can't buy that kind of thing. You need to really be able to use your ears, and that's what jazz is. It's just learning to use your ear, and it doesn't matter what instrument you're playing. If you can't hear it, you can't play it. So that's why, yeah, you really have to use the oral side of things, and that's what I did. So when I became, I went into brass bands, of course, and that's where my brass playing career kind of started with Bessie to the Barn Band in North Manchester, just near Bury. Because my grandfather and my father were both members of that band, and I joined in, and then I left that band in '78, just after I went to the Royal Northern College in '77, under the great Terry Nagle, trombone, who was a famous Halley player. He's one of the few trombone players that's played each position in an orchestra. He played first, second, and bass trombone in the Halley. He's an amazing player, you know. He's obviously long dead now, but he was a great mentor of mine. And even then I was doing jazz, and I think the first real structured bit of jazz was when I was playing in the Bessie's band, playing first trombone, and the second trombone player used to play in a dance band, and he asked me, would you like to come along and play in a jazz, you know, a big band, dance band kind of thing, and I said yes, it would be a good experience for me. So I went along, sat in on third trombone or something. And then they got to the last piece of the gig they were playing, and I'd just been playing the part, just like you'd play in an orchestra or a band or anything. You just read the music and play it, as you know, in a big band. And it got to the last piece, and they did Woodchopper's Ball, and he neglected to tell me that in Woodchopper's Ball, everybody in the band has a solo. So they were going along each one, like the first trumpet, second trumpet, third trumpet. They all took a solo. Or every sax player took a solo, and I could see what was happening. You know what I mean? And then you think, well, this is it. What do you do? Do you
Worst 5 minutes of your life, I should think.
Well, that's it. I'm still playing away, you know, Woodchopper's Ball. It's basic blues, you know. So I'm never having done this before. What do you do? Do you stand up and, you know, make a fool of yourself, or do you stay sat down, or even make a bigger fool of yourself? So I elected to stand up and just play something. And of course, everybody knew I was not in that. And they give you a shuffle of the feet and a clap, and you sit down and you feel great. And you don't know what you've played. You just try to use whatever ear training you've got and play to the tune and play to the chord structure for whatever you can do. But doing it for the first time is very much like jumping in the deep end of the pool. And once you've done it once, the second time isn't anywhere near as bad. And that's how we really started off. And then I did some playing at school on the trombone. Obviously, I was playing trombone when I was at grammar school in Manchester, Stretford Grammar School I went to. And it just so happened that my maths teacher was a jazz bass player, upright bass player, Mr. Cartridge, his name was. And we had a German teacher who was blind, who was a jazz pianist. A blind jazz pianist who taught German in the school. He was one of my German teachers. And we used to play, we had a little trio put together for like a cheese and wine parents, teacher evening, association evening. And I always remember the guide dog used to sit under the piano very patiently and just wait for him while he was playing. And we put a little trio together. So I had my maths teacher on bass, I had my German teacher on piano, and I was playing like, just some jazz in the front of the trombone. And it just felt great to be able to like small group stuff, because you're much more in control when you're doing that. And that's really, I think, where it all started.
That's amazing. I mean, I love these stories because every musician has those kinds of story. I mean, for me,
oh, yes.
I grew up not a million miles away from you in North Derbyshire in the Peak District.
All right, yes.
And just on the south side of Manchester. And in fact, our piano tuner was a blind musician who who had an astonishing ear and would improvise kind of in a tonal fashion. And
Yes.
he, I had lessons with him, and in the same way, and it kind of launched in me a sense of there being a world that I was able to sort of go into. And
Yes.
I was just thinking how important these chance encounters are for all of us, that we meet people by chance as
Yes.
kids, their teachers or something in the school. I mean, how do you think it is for musicians starting out now? Is that the same and it's still, or are there pressures, what with internet and, electronic stuff? And I mean, is it easier or harder, do you think,
That's
now
a
that
very
people
good
don't make
question.
their own fun so much?
Because the youth of today are obviously exposed to much more technology than we ever were.
We're
But there are
sounding a
certain
little elderly, aren't we?
Yeah, yes, I know, it feels that way. But the thing is, there are certain things in life which are constant, and that's the human condition. And there are where the kids who have that spark of musicality in them will always present with it, and you can always see it. It doesn't matter what they're exposed to. If it's in them, it will come out. And that's one of the few things about music. Live music. It's been the same ever since the dawn of the music started. Somebody knocked two bones together. Ever since that, the actual act of making music is essentially the same. We have different forms of doing it, but all at the end of the day, we're just making vibration that sounds pleasing to the ear. And it doesn't matter if you're a caveman or if you're, 20th, 21st century man. So I think a lot of it is just learning to deal with the technology, and that's when they're exposed to computers these days. And if you're using a computer to write music, you have to realise that using a computer program is it's basically a glorified pencil and paper. That's how you should look at it, really. You can't,
Interesting
the
that you
music.
say that.
Yeah,
I've, I've just this week, in fact, the week that we're speaking, I've been talking a lot to students about the fact that the software in which they often use composition is not designed for sketching. It's designed for delivering a finished product. So
yeah,
as soon as you start with it, it asks you, well, what meter are you using? What are your
yeah,
what are your bars? And it gives you all these bar lines, and that's no use to them. They need to be able to sketch and cross things out, and
yeah,
that's not what it's for. But of course, we often get technology without necessarily a clear idea of what it's really for,
yeah.
and that gives all kinds of issues to us as teachers.
Well,
Um,
there are certain programs, as you know, that actually you can just put things together, things that have always been recorded, and you can just take that phrase and add it to this phrase, and a lot of the children think they're composing music when actually the music's already been written. When you're faced, as you know yourself, when you're faced with a blank page on Sibelius or Finale, whatever program you're using, it's exactly the same as being faced with a blank page of manuscript paper and a pencil. You still have to have the ideas. Obviously, it makes it a lot easier and quicker to get down. But if you can't write it with a pencil and a ruler, then you can't write it with like Sibelius or Finale or whatever. So you have to
that's
have that initial spark.
exactly what I'm saying. And I think also that even some software is not so much a level playing field because it has certain expectations built into it about the kind of thing you'll do. And the less conforming you want to be, the harder it is to make it do
Yeah,
it. Because,
yeah,
all software is surely commercial at some level,
yeah.
whereas there's nothing commercial about our friend, the piece of manuscript paper.
No, exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
and I always say that that kind of blankness is your friend. It may not
Well,
help
exactly.
you on the face of it, but
Well,
it
when
doesn't
when you-
matter.
when you have a piece of manuscript just like you showed me there, it's brutal in its simplicity and its
Exactly,
expectation.
exactly.
That piece of paper is looking at you and say, "Come on, what have you got?" And then it's not like you've got other things you can think about. A lot of the problem with the modern programs these days, surveillance, they're very, very powerful, but there's just so much going on there that you can get sidetracked very easily. It's happened to me in the past when I've been writing music, and you can spend far too much time on trying to find like the right sound for this particular. and you're spending half an hour trying to get the playback to sound quite good, when really you're writing music for real musicians to play, and the music you hear from the computer shouldn't really matter.
No.
You know, it's about what's on the page, and that's what I mean about being brutal in its expectation. You have to really get cut down to what you're trying to achieve at the end of it.
Absolutely. Well, that welcome to my teaching life.
Yeah,
Those are the
yeah,
messages I deal in every day, as any
yeah,
student watching will know. Um, we're talking about you as composer here, so I want to get things slightly in the wrong order
right.
because we haven't talked yet about QUB Big Band, which is the
Oh
main
yes, yes,
traditional jazz thing. But before we come to that, I'd like to talk about your writing and well, maybe hear something. So you are a jazz composer. I mean, was that a departure for you, or did that just seem natural?
well, it was in many ways it was through necessity. In that, when I was at the Royal Northern studying trombone, there was a good friend of mine, David Adams. We started at the same year, 1977. There were only two trombone players allowed in that year. That was me and David. And David was half study trombone, half percussion. He's a superb drummer, and he's actually now the drummer for Lion King in the West End. And we became big friends, and we all had a love. We had both had a love of jazz and music and pop music and all sorts of music, and we wanted to put together a band. And this is how it basically the whole thing started, was that we knew all our brass players, so we put together. They all used to congregate underneath the seating of the concert hall in the Royal Northern. I don't know if you know it. You've probably been in there
Yeah.
several times. Yeah. Well, it's changed a bit from what it used to be. There used to be a space underneath the seating, and that was where the brass players used to practice. So we put together a band of trumpet players and trombone players with a rhythm section, and we called it Brass Injection. So essentially, it was like a big band, but without saxes. And then we had to write music for that, because obviously that was a non-standard ensemble. There wasn't music written for that kind of ensemble. So I wrote some music, I arranged music, Dave did the same, just for something for us to play. See what I mean? Because we had nothing to play otherwise. So we wrote this music, all by hand, of course, in those days, and handed that out. And that's where really you learn your craft of how to write for, certainly in our case, for brass, and then how to write for rhythm sections, chords or chords and all that, how to write drum notation, all that kind of stuff. And we put it all together. Then, if you want me to talk about how the timeline went, it was we had a visit from Tony Coe. That was the first one. Yeah, Tony Coe came over, the famous saxophonist, to do some improvisation classes.
Dan Tracy Big Band.
Yes. So the thing was, in those days in the colleges, like modern music and jazz was kind of in for a dig. You know, it was all classical and Mozart and stuff. So they didn't want much to do with it, but they put together this class about improvisation, which was really good. And then they got, well, that went really well. Let's get John Patrick to do the same thing from London. So he came as an arranger. And they used to do improvisation classes, and then we already had Brass Injection going, and the wind players who were involved in this came along and said, look, would you like to do a big band, because I'd want to play in a group as well. And that's how basically the Royal Northern College of Music Big Band started. They asked me would I direct it, because I'd been directing Brass Injection up to that time, and we did. So, and that's when we got Johnny Patrick came. I asked him, have you got any music? He sent me some music. I wrote some music because we had to put a concert together. And you know what it's like when you're trying to put a concert together. You need music. So we didn't have any. So I thought, well, I'll write some. I'll arrange some. We already had the Brass Injection stuff, but then I just added saxes to various things and wrote new pieces for big band. And we had the first concert. And that's how the big band over there started. And it's still going strong now to this day, as far as I know.
I mean, I'm hugely admiring of your skill as a student, presumably 21 or whatever, arranging so confidently for the big band lineup with all those transpositions and things, which I still, as a 60-something composer, find terrifying. And that's, I speak as somebody who plays in your big band. So
Yeah.
I think that's an amazing achievement, because I know from having played them how absolutely wonderfully your original compositions work for big band. But you have a range of flavors. You're very adept at kind of pulling out flavors that are outside jazz, whether classical or kind of 70s funk or that kind of thing. That was presumably just sort of natural. That's just part of your musical vernacular, I guess.
Well, yeah. Well, again, it comes down to listening. You know, at the time when we were doing brass injection, you're surrounded by brass, and you understand how the instruments work. You understand that each instrument has its sweet spot. It sounds like this in that register, and then if you write in that register, it's going to have a completely different sound. And then you just learn how they blend together. And of course, having done, you know, sitting in a symphony orchestra, you're on. And you're playing these great composers and orchestrators, Ravel and so on. You're subconsciously picking up as you're playing in this ensemble how they're arranging the music, using the instruments to the best ability and the best effect, basically, is what it is. And that's how I try to do it. Each instrument has its own tone color, which at the end of the day tells part of the story that you're trying to tell as a musician, you know, in your composition. And that's what I teach my kids today. When you're playing, you're telling a story. It's not a story in words, but it's still a story. There's still some narrative there, and you have to use the best tools to tell that narrative. And that's all I did. It wasn't, and I wouldn't say I was confident in it doing it when I started off. You just go ahead with the transposition, you know, like E flat instruments, B flat instruments, and all the other instruments, and then just learning about French horns. They have their own thing to do, and in F, you know, there are all various ways of dealing transposition instruments. They all have their own technical challenges to overcome. But I think underlying it all is if you can hear what you're trying to achieve, then it doesn't really matter. You know what key you're in, and then you can just do the relationship of the notes rather than getting bogged down in the technicality of it. The technicality is just something you can learn, and if you want to get this, you write that. And after a while, that just becomes second nature. I was always I never wrote in C. My scores, I always wrote transposed. Because if you write in C and you're writing for a transposing instrument, you're not really getting a true flavour of where they are in their register. And I always like to see on the page whereabouts they are playing, and that gives me a sense of how it's going to sound in relation to everything else. Yeah. So that's what I do.
Indeed. I've had some hairy experiences with student compositions using bass clarinet recently, which is a particular nightmare because it has a huge range, so it uses multiple clefs. But of course, the written sound is the written one is a treble clef thing, and sometimes you look at the score and you don't know which they're doing. And then we have had many conversations about this, and I tell them that it's all part of becoming a musician. But
exactly,
actually, I find saxes a very useful thing for. Because I'm biased because I'm a kind of a sax player, but I find them very useful for explaining transposition, because it seems to me transposing instruments arise as a family. You know, somebody wanted to play lots of different sizes of horn with different crooks, so you write them all the same and then they sounded different. Same with saxes, you finger them all the same and write them all in the treble clef, but of course they're all different sizes, so they all sound different pitches. And nobody ever explained that to me, about why all these instruments should not sound like they look, which on the face of it is balmy, isn't it?
Well, I suppose if you think about it, it makes it easier. You're going to write within the stave somehow or other, and like an E flat instrument, if you write it at pitch, it's going to be either too high on the stave to read easily or too low with lots of ledger lines. It's it makes it easier to write it and read it. At the end of the day, that's the practicality of playing an instrument. You've got to be able to, you know, transfer what you see immediately to what you hear, and that's one of the things about writing for a transposing instrument, I suppose.
Yeah. So we're going to hear some music of your own compositions. Are you still writing for big band, or are these follies of youth for you?
Oh no, well no, I'm still having some ideas, and I've been a bit lazy just recently, especially with the lockdown. I should have got down to it more often. But I'm definitely thinking about doing some more. I have some pieces that I've been reorchestrating, like High Life, which I did not so long ago, which was originally written for brass injection. It didn't have saxes.
No saxes.
No, so I took that and I put the saxes in that to make it into a big band piece. And I'll probably do some more of that, and I've got some ideas as well for writing pieces. It's just actually, as you know, it's just getting yourself and get going, and that blank sheet or the blank screen is very daunting sometimes.
Well, you've overcome that blank, so let's hear some music now. And that was one of Steve's own compositions, Crosstalk, played by QUB Big Band in 2018. As you heard Steve himself telling the crowd, solos were by Paul Schumann on alto and Matt Evans on piano. So, Steve, we were listening a minute ago to the QUB Big Band in action. This has been, for me, selfishly, as a humble member, has been a great chance to rekindle with the first music I was ever aware of, which was jazz. Yeah. Probably like you, I went to hear the Ellington Band in the Free Trade Hall on the 1961 tour, and I was apparently the youngest person there. And I got all their autographs, and that kindled for me an ambition when I saw Harry Carney playing the baritone sax, an ambition which I'm afraid you've borne the brunt of. But tell me how you got involved with QUB Big Band and when.
Well, I'd already been teaching at Queen's for some years as a member of the orchestra. Obviously, there are many members of the orchestra who have taught and still teach there, and quite rightly so. They get the bright players. So I was teaching trombone. Yes, and it is very much a partnership, I think, because there's the theoretical side, and of course there's the practical side, which is a whole new ballgame. So you want the players to be able to go in there and teach, which is what I was doing. And then I think it was in 2002, Dr. Fiona Palmer, who was a friend at the time, because we used to see each other all the time, suggested they were trying to reorganize the live ensembles at Queen's. And she suggested we're thinking of putting together like a popular music ensemble in the worms of a big band, something like that. And I think she knew that I'd obviously been involved in the jazz side of things through various things I'd done in the past. So she said, would you be prepared to come along and direct it? And obviously I said, yes, that sounds great fun. And that's how basically it started. And I think the first concert was probably in the Whittle Hall, it would have been, I suppose, that year. And then we went from strength to strength, just trying to get the players, putting a band together. And as you know, as I keep going on about every year, the struggle it is to make sure you've got a band to actually put a concert together every year. And it's still the same to this day.
I mean, yeah, indeed, I know. It seems to me that Northern Ireland it punches above its weight in terms of jazz talent overall. But of course, that talent crops up in all kinds of different places, and you don't necessarily have, you can't guarantee in a small student body that there is a certain requisite number of people interested in jazz, even if in the province overall there maybe is that kind of turnout. So it is very difficult to maintain that. And one thing that I wish we had more scope for, if we had a big complement of students involved in jazz, we would be able to make more use of your amazing skills as a jazz teacher and a teacher of improvisation and jazz harmony, because in the past you've done that, and I found it extraordinarily interesting. And it's only because we don't have a sort of critical mass of enough students at any one time that maybe we haven't been able to do more of that. But there is amazing talent around the university, and of course, Ulster Youth Jazz Orchestra itself is a regular showcase for really astonishing young talent.
Yes, and it would be great to build on that. And of course, I mean, the university has always been known as a centre of excellence for music, but it's always been more based on like the classical music side of things, and it still is to a certain extent. And even though the barriers between the various genres of music is slowly being eroded, and which is exactly what I wanted to see and hear, in that fact that just because you play classical music you shouldn't denigrate jazz music, because essentially a lot of classical music is jazz music. Mozart would have been a fantastic jazzer in his days. All those composers were essentially, that's what they had in their head. If you hear it in your head, you're a jazz musician. All they're doing is take improvisations and just writing and notating it. So there's no reason why there should be that kind of, seeing it as inferior or not as good. As no genre of music is any worse or better than any other genre, I feel. So it's just about how it's performed. And that's one of the things I try and get over to the players that come along and play, is that this is another string to your bow. It's another weapon in your arsenal of being a musician. If you understand how the jazz side of things works, it can only do to help improve your other style of music playing, as long as you do it properly. And that's where a good teacher is very important.
A figure I'm particularly interested in is I'm always interested in classical players who switch over to jazz, and the Austrian pianist Friedrich Gulder was a great
Yes.
passion. He's a passion of mine now that we have YouTube, such incredible resources, because he was quite a celebrated jazz player who brings an extraordinary kind of improvisatory feeling of danger to his
Yeah.
classical, to his Beethoven sonatas and things,
Well,
you
it's
know.
funny you should say Friedrich Gulder, because when I was at the Royal Northern, I was asked if I would conduct the Friedrich Gulder. I think it was the second jazz piano concerto. And we had a
He
pianist, Peter
wrote,
Seaver. Oh yes, he wrote two
really? I'd forgotten
piano
about that.
concerti. He wrote two piano concertos, but they were jazz piano concertos.
Right.
Yeah, and Peter Seaverite played the piano, and it was like a really interesting lineup. So you had like saxes, there's French horn, there was a bass trumpet involved, drum kit, obviously bass. Lots of. It wasn't like a standard big band lineup. It was a non-standard group, but it was beautifully written. It's a fantastic piece. I think I have it on DAT somewhere, because it was recorded obviously at the Royal Northern, and it was performed as part of a concert. I can't remember exactly what year it was, but I distinctly remember doing it. Like I say,
That's
Peter
amazing. Yeah.
Seabright was the soloist, and it was
Really?
really, really a fantastic piece.
Wow. I wonder if that music exists. He's an extraordinary player. I love watching. I mean, he's one of the, in the most exciting way, he's one of the worst conductors I've ever seen on film.
Uh-huh.
An extraordinary way of kind of doing this, and of course the players clearly adore him and do
Yeah.
exactly what he wants and do it beautifully. But I mean, you look at him and you think, you know, occasionally I've seen a player come and smirking, and then he just turns back and plays the most celestial stuff. I mean, he
That's
was
one of the things you have to
astonishing.
remember. I think that the best soloists often don't make the best conductors.
Yeah.
Because to be a soloist, it's much more of an internal thing, whereas to be a conductor, you've got to externalize a steady beat. You have to be there for the players,
Yeah,
whereas soloists by definition are there for the soloist. You know what I mean? We've
absolutely.
had a few over the years in the orchestra, Dmitry Sitkovetsky, who have come in, and they're obviously fantastic musicians. There's no way you can't say that they're not great musicians, but being able to actually transmit that musicianship through your hands is a different skill, apart rather than actually just playing the way you feel it. But you need to show like 120
Yeah,
musicians to play together like that. So to be a good conductor, I've always felt you have to give yourself to the orchestra. You
yeah.
have to be almost invisible. It's not about you. It's about helping them play to their best ability and to get the best out of the music.
Absolutely. Well, I strongly recommend anybody watching to explore Friedrich Gulder, just really anything he did on the internet, on YouTube, because there are some very interesting concertos. There's a marvelous Mozart concerto video where I mean, he always wore this kind of cap and a
Yeah,
t-shirt, and then he goes off and he comes on all in black, plays the first half, and goes off and comes back all in white and plays the second half. I mean,
yeah,
absolutely terrific. It's so eccentric and,
yes,
completely serious. At the same time, I'm also interested in the way, for example, Keith Jarrett and Chick Corea,
yes,
they were recorded. They did the Mozart concerto for two pianos, and it's the
yes.
most. I thought this will be interesting. This will be very off the wall. It's the most rigid, mechanistic playing that I've ever
Yeah.
heard from these two extraordinary,
Yeah.
free-flowing artists. So it's a strange kind of mixing of
It's hard
worlds,
to
isn't
predict, isn't it? Yeah. Everybody has their own way of thinking about things.
it? Ooh.
Um,
And you were obviously for many years a jazz trombonist, but you were also in Queens particularly. You're also a pianist, and this talk is replacing, for now at least, a concert that we would have loved to bring, as we usually do at
yes.
Christmas, a jazz trio, in which you're no longer doing professional trombone, but you've kept jazz piano going through the years, even when
Oh
you were in the
yes.
orchestra? Yeah.
That was
Is
one of
that,
my first loves, really, is just playing the piano
yeah,
and just making the instrument sing to my own beat, as it were, you know. Um, I probably wouldn't be as technically good. I mean, there are local musicians, Scott Flanagan, who are excellent, you know. I wouldn't be anywhere as good as them. But in many ways, it doesn't matter. As long as you feel it in yourself and you can play it. And then I've always felt, you know, one of the things about playing jazz piano is that when you're playing in a combo, I'm there to help the soloist. So, for instance, we should have had Gordon Campbell this year playing,
yeah,
and it's just a
indeed.
joy to have great musicians standing up the front and being able to give them something to play against, you know, rather than
Yes.
being taking the limelight yourself. That's all, I always enjoyed doing that. So, you know,
Something that
company.
fascinates me when you've come to Queens to do jazz trios with people like Gordon and Alan Barnes and people
Yeah,
is the extraordinary ease, which is absolutely maddening to a classical person like me, the extraordinary ease with which a jazz concert unpacks itself on the morning. I mean, the most extreme case was the sax player who arrived at 10 to 1 when the gig started at 10 past 1 because the plane
yeah,
was late. And I was having a kind of complete double-dyed fit out in the foyer.
yes,
And
I
he just
remember.
strolled
Yeah,
in and started playing. I mean, you can't do that with a string quartet because of the, setting up the music and the hours of
yeah,
rehearsal. I mean, it seemed to me that your rehearsals consisted of kind of saying, right, here's the list. We're going to do the such and such,
yeah,
these charts. Now let's go for coffee. And that it seemed to me like it's a pop-up concert that invents itself. You must
yeah.
have lived in that double world all your life, I suppose.
Well, yeah, well, it's hard to remember when you weren't doing that, but I mean, I've certainly learned over the years when you're playing, especially in like a small ensemble or group like that, there are certain rules that we all follow. They're kind of unwritten rules,
Yeah,
and if you
yeah,
know those rules and conventions, then it's possible because we're all, with you know, using a cliche, singing off the same hymn sheet, as it were, you know. So we know how introductions, we know how we're going to start that, how many choruses we're going to play. Then we all have an idea of what's going to happen at the end. And because jazz is such an oral thing, we're all listening all the time. And all it takes is a little cue, the soloist plays something or somebody plays something, and we know where that's going to take it. Or we certainly have a very good idea where it's going to go. And then you are anticipating, and that allows you to keep together. There's always some sort of form, unless it's absolutely free jazz, which is a different genre anyway. But
yeah.
you have some idea of where the music's going to go, and that allows you to put together, structure an entire performance of a standard or whatever, you know.
Yes, because it seems when I'm watching these concerts that every piece actually has the same structure, and that you've got the riff itself that kind of
Yeah,
identifies the piece, and then you've got whatever solos using those chord changes, and then you've
yeah,
got coming together and a kind of finish up, and that
yeah,
structure is a kind of template, which of course is one of the big differences between that and kind of art music, as it were, in that every piece is different, and
yeah,
whenever I start a piece, I'm thinking, what will I do? Oh, I did that last time, maybe won't do that. And that's a very different aesthetic. It's something about jazz, isn't there, that it all works, however diverse, through this
yeah.
basic principle of, taking the tune and providing variations on it. And
Well, there are
that's,
certain things like, you know, when you're playing live like that, there are certain, like for instance, if Gordon was playing, Gordon would be in charge. And we all basically give over what we're doing to him. So we're listening to what he's playing, and when he plays something, we go with it. We know what's going to happen. The only difference that with the written music is that you have one person, the composer, who just writes that down ahead of time.
that's right. Yeah.
That's all it is, really, if you think about it. And once he's written that down, everybody's just taking their cue from what they're seeing rather from what they're listening to. But essentially, we're using the same tools. We're able to just structure a piece, you know, from beginning to end. And like you said there, like when we play a standard, there's they have an introduction of some description. You know, they play the head or the tune, which will be over a recognized form, A, or AB or whatever. There's usually some sort of form that you can recognize. And then the solos are based on that form. for however many times people want to solo. And again, it's a very, you can listen to what's going on, the way somebody's soloing. Are they going to carry on and do another chorus? Are they coming to their end of their chorus? Sometimes they're visual cues, just like a little turn of the head will give you an idea, oh, they're coming to the end of their chorus now, somebody else is going to go. It's very, very subtle. You know, if you're in the audience, unless you knew what you were looking for, you wouldn't recognize it. And all these things are happening all the time on stage. You're either listening, and that's why jazz is such a, you know, you get immersed in it because you're using all your senses all the time. And it's very, very fulfilling, you know, when you get to the end of it.
Absolutely. There are great mysteries here, really. Just as you were talking, I was reflecting on the fact that music's outside the classical canon in which you and I both trained are often thought to be more free, but in some sense they're actually more structured, because, you know, anything can happen in an art music piece. You know, the composer decides, as you say, and then fixes it. Whereas in, you know, in an Irish trad reel, or many other kinds of music, or in blues, or in jazz music, which obviously uses a lot of blues, uses the structure, there is a basic template, and the freedom is of a different sort. It's maybe on the
well, you have to remember, you know, there's an awful lot of work and thought goes into making things spontaneous.
Yes, indeed.
See what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's stuff that
it doesn't happen overnight.
Yeah, you can't make, the only way to make things sound completely improvised is that you have to have had some sort of thing going on in the background. Even people who just start playing together and just start what at first glance or first hearing sounds completely improvised and free, those people playing it are calling on experiences they've done before, either with that same person or somebody else. So they know what to expect to a certain extent, even when things are free. And again, they're just listening to pick up these tiny cues all the time to see what's going on. And that's how it works. You know, otherwise you just have chaos, you know.
Exactly. And how true it is that listening is crucial to all music making.
Yes.
I mean, I was very struck when the Ulster Orchestra moved into the Waterfront Hall for its kind of lockdown autumn this year, 2020, to hear players saying, well, this is different. It's difficult being spaced out because I'm in the second violins and I usually listen to the cellos, and they're right over there. And you know, I think that people who sit listening to music in audiences often assume that maybe, you know, you're staring at the conductor and you're doing what the conductor says, whereas in fact all those signals are coming from all around, and they need people to be nearby.
Well, I have some experience of that because, I mean, at the beginning of November, I was fortunate enough to be asked to go and conduct the orchestra in the Waterfront Hall and do a recording there of like a popular program that's going to be sent out. And that was a very interesting and different experience. I mean, I've conducted the orchestra on many occasions in the past, but when you have like 60 odd people spaced out in the size of 120 odd people, so that the tubas on one side of the floor of the Waterfront Hall, not the stage is completely flat. They're filling the whole of the floor of the Waterfront Hall. So you have the tuba and the percussion on one side of it, and then you have like the piccolo on the complete opposite side of it. So for the first thing, you know, on practical things, even when you're conducting, you're looking to a section, it's not even where you expect it to be because it's so spread out, and you have to, you know, you look around, and then the strings are all spread out, and then you have to suddenly come to a decision. Well, just a minute, I can't listen to what I'm doing. If I try and listen to things, then the timing is going to be completely off. The only way then you can do it is to just rely on a really good beat. And then they will rely on that because the microphones will pick up the sound where it is, and then, you know, not where it's going to be. So that's the only thing you can rely on. And it was a very strange experience until you get used to it. You just have to rely on your own sense of internal pulse and hope they do the same, and then just take it from there.
One of many effects on the arts that we try to practice brought about by this COVID crisis. And another of them is, of course, the fact that QUB Big Band has not been able to function during this year, or during much of this year, because of the whole necessity of distancing and things. But we look forward very much to getting back together with you and playing in our usual venues in Belfast as soon as all this is resolved, and
Absolutely,
it can't be too soon enough for us to
yes,
have more music making. And also, we look forward to the concert sometime in 2021, which
yes,
this talk temporarily replaces, because we would have had you and other jazz colleagues coming in to play our traditional pre-Christmas jazz concert
yes.
this week at the time of speaking, and we look forward to having you then. But in the meantime, Steve, thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate hearing all the wealth of tales and experience that you bring, with you to music in and around Belfast. And we're going to try and play out with some music here, and to go back to QUB Big Band for something. But here's to the jazz resuming sometime soon in 2021. And thank you very much for joining us.
Absolutely. It's been my pleasure, Piers.
Thank you.
Please put us together for David Howell on tenor, Martin Wilson on trombone, Tom Wall on trumpet, and of course Matt Evans on piano.